Right, rook and 2 pawns versus rook and 1 pawn, where the pawns are on opposite wings. I already said in the last video, rook and 2 pawns versus rook and 1 pawn, pawns on the same wing, that now that we've moved on from rook and 1 pawn versus rook, where there's just sort of a comprehensive, systematized, almost encyclopedic knowledge of all the various permutations and all the different things that we should be aware of, because it would just be so useful to know it all inside out. We've got to move away from that, because there's just too many different combinations when it gets to rook and 2 versus rook and 1, and we're more into ideas. So lots and lots of different positions coming up in this video, with lots and lots of different ideas, many positional ideas, many tactical ideas. There's quite a few, sort of, as always with rook endings, interesting tactical shots that both sides need to be aware of. So it's really just a case of trying to assimilate as many of those ideas as possible and hopefully use them in your games or in our games, so that we can get the best possible result. We can get the desirable result. We can maybe rescue draws from lost positions, or convert winning positions that are hard to convert, or hold drawing positions that are hard to draw, but we know the ways in which to do it. So you could call it a repertoire of tricks, I suppose, but they're not all tricks. A lot of it's positional themes. And one of the first rules, if you like, I mean, one of the beautiful things about chess is that the rules are there to be broken. There's always an exception to the rule. I think that's one of the reasons it's such an incredible game, is that it's not just a case of following a bunch of rules and then they always work. Sometimes there's an exception to them. But a rule that's pretty good is that when you've got passed pawns and your opponent has 2 in rook endings, you want your king supporting your passed pawns, and you want your rook dealing with your opponent's passed pawn. So if we could magically swap our king and rook round in this position as white, we've won. Because it's going to be very easy to lose the rook for this pawn and use our king to support these 2 up the board. You've just got to be a little bit careful not to get your rook interfered with, so that it's 2 pawns versus a queen rather than 2 pawns versus a rook. But very easily one position if we swap the king and the rook round. As it is, it's still looking pretty good for white. This is a study from 1936, by the way, which illustrates a theme straight away. And it's actually a theme that we saw in rook versus pawns. So if you've got a rook versus 2 connected passed pawns, remember that if the 2 connected passed pawns, if the kings are miles away, so forgetting about the tail hook stuff, but if the kings are miles away, which they are here, if those 2 connected passed pawns get to the 6th rank, the side with the rook has had it. They have one last saving try, and that's checkmate threat trickery. So they do like perpetual checkmate threats, and it's the only way to get out of it. And that's exactly what happens here. It's how black saves themselves. Excuse me. So although we want our king over here and we've got a rook over there, never mind. This is still pretty good. These pawns over here are you're going to autopilot or self-propelled pawns. B6, A5, rook A7, and repeat. If black didn't have this, that is exactly how white would win this position. Very, very quickly. There wouldn't be anything to discuss. So it is just this that's going to stop us from winning it. So yeah, B6, king into F4, A5, rook F2 check. Now, which way are we going to go with our king? Well, if we go to G1, that wouldn't be as good as going to E1. The black king comes in opposite. King F1, king F3. That's where, if we played king F1, by the way, that's where black would go straight away. King E1, and then black plays H4. We're about to see this position in a minute anyway, but with the black king still on F4, which is obviously better for white. So when checked, come towards the rook, king E1. H-pawn gets pushed, rook A7, H3, uh-oh, rook across, H2, and this is the bit where you're like, well, okay, 2 connected passed pawns on the 6th rank, that wins, so we'll just take the pawn. And in this position, by the way, I mean, A6, if it wasn't for the checkmate threat trickery that black's now got up their sleeve, A6 or B7, either would win. By the way, if white doesn't take that pawn and just tries to bring their king over to hassle the black rook, the black king makes contact with the h pawn. And now white's can't do anything about it because they can't deflect the black rook off the b file anymore with rook takes h2. And this black rook, I mean, it's stopping the a pawn advancing at the moment, and it's just going to come to b5. If you took the white rook and the black pawn off the board, and it's black to move, rook b5 wins. Okay, and in fact, I think even if it was white to move, there's nothing white can do to advance those pawns, and black has one. So yeah, we don't want the black king making contact with the h pawn. I mean, this is still a draw. The white king would now just go on a check the white rook would go on a check the hell out of the black king mission there, and it would be a draw. But there's just no point playing king d1. We have to try this rook takes h2, and you think, well, that's just a win now, right? b7. Those pawns can't be stopped by the rook. And all black's got is this checkmate threat. And it doesn't matter which way you run. I mean, white's got to be careful not to lose this. For example, if they try and run away this way, oops, white's now lost. So the white king can't run away to b1. And if they run away this way, they've got to come back to e1 now. And we'll just see the game end. The white king will just sort of run around between c1 and f1, and the black king will just follow it. Because if the white king in this position comes to g1, it's another oops moment. Rook g2 check, king h1, black attacks the b pawn. That b pawn has to be defended, otherwise white's obviously lost. King g3, and checkmate will follow. So yeah, we'd see a draw after this. So that was pretty a pretty cool study from 1936. I mean, it wasn't a study in terms of having like a bonkers solution like a lot of studies highlighting the power of the pieces or whatever, or transferable skills. It was just a perfectly plausible position from a game, and I guess it demonstrates that although these pawns are self-propelled, like autopilot, the black just had that checkmate threat, trickery up their sleeve. Oh, one final thing to be aware of, sorry I forgot to talk about it, is that in that checkmate threat trickery, you know, if you ever get this in your games, it's unlikely to be any good if the pawns are a bit more central, because, I mean, if the white king goes to b1 or g1, then we saw how black wins that position. But the black king's going to have to follow the white king on those squares there, and you've just got to watch out that this pawn promoting doesn't come with check. Okay, so luckily we don't have to go to g3 as part of the checkmate threat trickery, otherwise it would be lost. Right, next, this is a study from 1976 by Smyslov, and this illustrates very nicely how in rook endings, if you end up with your rook being really passive, so that white rook on a1 is just being used as a blocker of the a2 pawn, then it really is such a disadvantage, and we'll see that this position's drawn. So in effect, the passivity of this rook is basically worth 2 pawns. That's what it's worth to black, to have made white's rook so passive. Yeah, I mean, let's just go through it, see how it's drawn. So rook a3 check, king d4. I mean, you could try king d2, but black will just come back and hit the a pawn. We either go around in circles, or black will come back and hit the f pawn. We either go around in circles or white pushes, and you can see that, you know, those pawns are sort of falling very soon, and white's going to have nothing more than a draw there. So not king d2, or if king d2, king back to e3, and then repeat king d4, come in this way. Check, king c3, rook takes the f pawn, and rook takes the a pawn. So we swap the f pawn for the a pawn, and it's just really easy for black to draw from here. Rook f5 works. I mean, the black king's just got just enough space on the 7th and 8th ranks there. Or instead of rook f5, rook h4, just come and hit the h pawn. There's another way to draw it. Rook a7, king g8, check. What does white do? The h pawn's hit. Oh, by the way, actually, this is a nice try by white to do it this way. Check. Because at this position here, Well, what black's going for is this. And this is the pawn configuration that's going to lead to the Klingon-Horwitz setup that I covered on the Kasparian position videos. Not the Kasparian position, it's like what we need to understand before we look at the Kasparian position, which is just that this is a drawn position in rook and 2 versus rook. So yeah, that's the pawn configuration that black wants, and hence in this position, don't play king h7, because you'll give white the pawn configuration that they want, and that's just completely over. A white rook's going to be coming to h7 very soon and pushing the g-pawn. So that would be gone. As it is, you think, well, why can't white do the same sort of thing? Why can't a white rook come to g7 and push the pawns? And well, let's see, because that is how the Klingon-Horwitz defensive setup. That's one of the things that white can try. Okay, rook g7, rook g8, sorry, king h7, rook g7 check, king h8, and the difference is that this rook is now desperado because our king is stalemated, which is irritating for white. It means they have to get their rook out of there, but then you can hit the g-pawn. Rook e5, only way to defend the g-pawn other than go around in circles. In fact, that wouldn't even go around in circles, would it? I think if rook g7, we could immediately start. I think we could pre-move the plan of always putting white in check, couldn't we, on the 4th rank? That we can actually pre-move that entire plan if white played rook g7 there, but it's drawn anyway. Rook e5, king h7, king d3, and king settles itself down into g6. Remember that if this wasn't a knight and a rook's pawn, then white could probably win this eventually by bringing their king to g4 with their rook on the same rank, the 4th rank, and then the plan would be rook f6 check, swap the rooks, and then you move your king to the I6 square. The I6 square does not exist on a chessboard, but if that wasn't a rook's pawn, there would be a square to the right of that h6 pawn. So yeah, I guess the thing we learned there, I mean, this was a study deliberately set up to illustrate a point. So, I'm never going to get that in a game. Possibly. Well, almost probably you're never going to get that exact position in a game. But you might get games where you can force, you're defending rook and 3 pawns in this case versus rook and 1. And, yeah, you just force the attacking side to have such a passive rook. It's worth, such an asset for you. Now, a fascinating story surrounding this is that everything that I've just been through, Smyslov and Dvoretsky went through when he came up with that stuff in 1976, but they went through it in this position, all the same ideas. But in 2014, some guy called Muller came back and said, well, yeah, all those same ideas are very good, but white's actually got a different winning plan in this position, and it's a winning plan that doesn't work here, which is why it's ended up in Dvoretsky's endgame manual. Everything we've just been through, the theme of the passivity of the a1 rook, why it's ended up, it had to be the pawn on the a file. But it's interesting to try and think. I mean, you could pause the video if you wanted to and think about what's so different about this. What's the different winning plan that white's got, with this pawn being one file this way, is just so crucial in that plan. So here it is. Rook b3 check, king e4, rook b4 check. Black's like, don't think much of this plan so far. It looks like I'm just checking the hell out of your king. And obviously, if the king settles down in here, rook b4, that's just hopeless. White's not getting anywhere there. But here's the plan. King e6, check. King d5, check. Still can't see your plan. And then the white king comes and hits the black rook. And black's like, well, yeah, but you're too far away now from the pawns. I'll hit your f pawn. And oh, by the way, if instead of oh no, sorry, that's on the next move. I'll hit your f pawn and you push it, and now I'll just come and gobble up your g pawn. Or attack your g pawn. I'm going to be winning at least one of those pawns and getting into a drawn position quite soon. By the way, in this position, if black plays rook b8 and just sort of refuses to give up their b pawn on account of, like, no, I'm not going to start doing pawn eating, mutual pawn eating. I'm going to keep my b pawn because you're still not making any progress. White can create an h5 annex for their king with h6 check, and black plays king h7, say. And I mean, just to illustrate sort of how finely balanced this is, king c5 would now still throw away the win because you're not getting your king over quickly enough, and black could pounce with rook g8, check, king takes h6, takes the pawn, king into g5, rook f2, king f6. And there's just nothing that white can do. I mean, they try and bring their king over. I think if black lets them bring their king over, they might be in trouble, but black just plays rook e8. Remember, the winning plan is to stick your king on f4, bring your rook, get your rook to the 4th rank, protecting checks as well, and then go rook e6 check, because the black rook will be defending on this file. And then this would be a win after the swap of the rooks. You bring your king to h6, but black's just not allowing white to even set that up. The rook's just passively defending this f-pawn. So, yeah, I mean, after creating this annex, don't play something like king c5. White's got lots of winning moves here, but king c5 is just illustrative of how it is on a knife edge. But yeah, just bring your king back. King d5. We might see rook b4, king e5. Black's like, okay, you're moving your king away now, I'll start checking you. But we've got that annex on h5. Black could play rook b3, thinking, okay, if you go to h5, I'll check you and come back. But white can put black in zugzwang with king h4. So in this position here, something passive like rook b8, saying I'm not giving up my b pawn, and just, you know, what have you got? Because the answer is white says, well, I've got this, and now my king's coming to h5 and you're dead. Okay, so at this point, in this winning plan, where white's brought their king over to the c file to sort of hit the black rook, then we come over to start having a go at these pawns. h6 check, king h7, take the b pawn. Black's like, aha, I've won your best pawn. But here's the winning plan. You just stick your rook behind the f-pawn. Black just drops their rook back to block, push the f-pawn, takes f7, rook f8, king d6. If this king had started on b6, imagine the white king had come over to the b file to hit the black rook, and it went in from this position. Where's it gone? In this original position, this Smyslov study from 1976, the difference was the pawn was on the A file. So here, that white king would have started its journey on B6, and it just wouldn't be in time. Black would now be winning that pawn here, of course. Black's losing the game. There you go. So yeah, I thought that was quite interesting. This position is drawn because of the passivity of this rook. This position is also very hard to win, again because of the passivity of this rook. And the only way that white could do it was to bring their king up the board, bring it all the way to the c file to attack the black rook, and then come back with their king just in time to help with the promotion of that f-pawn. Right, next, this is a position from 1893, and it's a game between Tarrasch and Chigorin. So on the 2 versus 1 same side of the board video, I covered a Chigorin versus Tarrasch game, and this is Tarrasch versus Chigorin. I forget who won, but I don't know. I don't think anyone cares. But this is a position from 1893. It's black to play, and they've only got one drawing move in this position. It wasn't the one played in the game, but we can kind of understand the one played in the game in what black's trying to achieve. So in the game, rook a2 was played, and I'll come back to this in a sec. But I want to go away to a very similar but different position, which is this. And this is also black to play. I mean, they haven't got this as a particular game, but I'll be astonished if we couldn't find a chess game somewhere that once had this position. And it is a draw if it's black to play, but only because this white pawn is still on the third rank. Okay. Now Dvoretsky calls this a very, very important position, and I agree that it is a very important position. I also recommend that we have to understand the Vancouver defense and the not the Vancouver position, which I covered in other videos. It's just, in my view, so important to understand those, because they are sort of base knowledge for so much that goes on in rook endgames, particularly where, you know, we've got a pawn on either the 6th or the 7th rank, and the side that's trying to promote that pawn has got their rook stuck in front of it. Okay. So in fact, you know, if we didn't have these two pawns on the board, without looking at the exact mechanics of it, white would be wanting to bring their king back to g2, and whilst that pawn's still on a3, the white rook would want to be coming down to the 3rd rank to attack that pawn laterally. So that's just the Vancouver defense that we have to know about. So it's always there, sort of lurking in the background. It's definitely worth understanding those. Anyway, how does black draw this position? Well, it's on the theme of, you've got to get the a pawn pushed quickly. And the reason is that we want to, any rook move this way now, and we are threatening to promote that pawn. Okay, so any rook move that way, and we're threatening to promote that pawn. And in the not the Vancouver defense video, if you ever get that without these two pawns on the board, that's why the white king has to quickly get to g2, because otherwise they're going to get checked, and they can't even come to collect the pawn because of the skewer idea. I don't really want to get too sidetracked by that, but that's where the white king would belong without their pawns, is on g2. But it's a similar idea, and we're not going to be delivering check, well, unless white stupidly comes to the f file, in which case, yes, we'll deliver check and queen, and we might even be winning that position. I think we probably are winning that position with these pawns so far back and our king in front of them. But white's not going to allow that check. But the crucial point is that because their g pawn is still on the 3rd rank, they have no way to sort of progress. They don't want to come to the f file. That's probably lost if they come to the f file. I mean, they can push the h pawn, fine. But black just plays a waiting move, king h7. Do not play king h6. Okay. White stalemates the black king and forces the black rook to move and give up the a pawn. Okay, that's a little trick to watch out for. So black just plays a waiting move, king h7, and there's just no way for white to move their king without making it exposed to a check or unprotecting their g pawn. So you just come and attack. You're threatening a1 equals queen. I mean, white can try a check, but they just can't get close enough to make it a checkmate threat. This pawn being stuck back on g3 was a problem, and of course this is a draw. Now, if we just play some silly moves to recreate this position with white to move. Did I do the silly moves there? Sorry, these are the silly moves. Do some silly moves to get that position with white to move. There it is, same position but white to move. Some silly moves there. Then, because this pawn hasn't got to a2 yet, now we can play king g5. Because if a2, g4. And now the pawns are too far up the board. King f7, h5, king back to g7 because this h pawn's coming through. Check, the black king's on the back rank. King f8, h6, the h pawn's coming through, you've got to stop h7. So king g8 and king g6, and now you think, aha, your g pawn's unprotected. It's like, well, yes, but that's checkmate. Okay, you didn't have that if it was one rank further down. So the pawn being on the 3rd rank in that original position was crucial for black's drawing move to be a2. Let's go back to that 1893 game between Tarrasch and Chigorin, and you can see that's sort of what he's trying to do. He's trying to get the you know, that sort of idea, but it's just too slow, and white's going to be able to get that pawn past the 3rd rank. So king into g4, rook a1, check, king f7, king g5, a2, g4. There it is. I mean, white's got the chance to blunder away the win here. I can't see how anyone would ever do that. Okay. I mean, if you're in this position and you play h5, I mean, you literally put zero thought into what your opponent's next move would be. You just not thought about it at all. It's like your opponent's pieces might as well not even be on the board, because that's how much time you spent looking at them playing h5. So yeah, rook a2 was a losing move. I mean, Tarash didn't play that, of course, or Shigorin, whoever it was. So back to the original position. What does Black do here? And this is a draw if you keep the rook active with a2. Okay. Just out of interest, this idea of having an active rook defending your pawn this way, and that's less of a threat now, because you're not threatening to check and promote at any point. This rook is just sort of tied a little bit to the defence of that pawn. Kind of. There is one other trick that is now on the radar. But this trick, it works nicely, as we're about to see, with this pawn configuration. It doesn't work against this pawn configuration, because the white king's got a sort of a place to hide a little bit more on h4. It's not immediately obvious why the white king needs a place to hide. Anyway, so h5 check, king f6, and the white king comes up, king h4. Straight away, I've said this many times, if you've got a pawn one square away from promotion and a rook behind it stopping it, that rook is not really doing anything over here. I know rooks move horizontally and vertically. This rook, if you like, has lost its ability to move horizontally, hasn't it? Because it's guarding the a1 equals queen vertically. And something that both sides should be on the lookout for at any given time is deflection on that idea. If the white king was on g5, for example, it can't be because the black king's on f6, white would have to be careful that rook c5 check doesn't win the game for black. You're going to end up with rook and two pawns versus a queen. So that's something that we should be on the lookout for. But it's not just a deflection with a check. It's a deflection, because the deflection doesn't look very clever, does it? At any given time, you just take the a pawn and say, well done. But I mean, at the moment, I guess it is threatened, because then the h pawn falls, and that would be a draw. That position, that looks very drawn to me, with this pawn back on g3. So white's got to defend their h pawn, and if they defend it with g4, oops, there it is, deflection. And white would be like, well, I'll just take your pawn. It's like, yeah, but we've reached the Klingon-Horwitz setup. You have no way to progress there. We know that's a drawn position from our study of rook and 2 versus rook. We know that's a drawn position. You always get this sort of this building of knowledge. That's why every time you get like a known chess endgame banked as knowledge, it just unlocks the next one. So it's like a prerequisite, and this is an example. You know, I mean, if you were in a game and white played g4, you might find rook c5 over the board. But if you didn't know that position was a draw, because you've studied it and you've learnt it, then you'd be here going, ooh, I wonder if white can make any progress there if I just play rook c5. You wouldn't know, would you? But here we do know, because we've learnt it. Great. So white would defend, I don't know, king h4, rook h2 check, king g4, rook back to b2. How does white make progress? Rook a6 check, king to g7, king g5, we chuck in a check, king h4, rook back to b2. It looks like white's making a bit of progress, g4. Here white is threatening h6 check. If black does nothing, white will play h6 check. And this is very bad news for black now. Their king's got back to the back rank. So back in this position, you can't do nothing. H6 check is being threatened. So we'll dodge that check. If white plays h6 now, it doesn't come with check. So we've got that one again. Rook b6. It's like, oh, that again. You got me again. It's like, yep, we have. Even if you don't take our a pawn straight away, our king is still nestling in here, and we've reached the Klingon-Horwitz defensive setup. So not not h6, rook a4, king g7, h6 check can no longer be played because the rook's not actually defending the h6 square. I mean, what can white do? If rook a6 attacking it again, we come away because h6 check was being threatened. If rook a7, king f6, white just has no way to make progress. They wanted to try the trick of forcing you to g7 when their rook's on a6, so they can play h6 check. They've spotted that they can't do that in, which position was it? Can't find the position now. But yeah, they spotted they can't play h6 in that position because you've got the deflection trick into the known drawn Klingon-Horwitz position. So yeah, push the g-pawn. I mean, that's all they've got left really. King f5, and now this king is just so badly placed. It's just sort of stuck on h4, defending those pawns. If the h-pawn gets pushed, check, king back to g3, rook back to h1. You know, we've got a rook guarding that one. The king's going to be gobbling this up. Or again, if we see a check, it's going to make its way into that, nestle its way into that little square there for the Klingon-Horwitz setup, or better than that, to be honest. So we'd probably say rook takes e2 and king takes g5. Or in this position, I mean, the only other thing that black's got is, the white's got, sorry, in this position, rather than pushing the h-pawn, is just a bunch of checks. Rook a5 check, king f4, rook a4 check, king f5, and so on. So yeah, that's something to be on the lookout for. There's a few tactical ideas there, but rook a2 was played in the game, and it's just too late because this g-pawn's going to get off the third rank in time. But instead, if you play a2, you keep an active rook whilst defending this pawn laterally, and you've got to be ready to use the deflection idea into the drawn setup. So you're not deflecting to you know, trying to get a check and queen the pawn. It's just sort of saying you let white take the pawn in this position, for example. Say, go on then, take the pawn. But you're quite happy to play rook and 2 versus rook. That's a drawn position. Right, next. This is a game between Reshevsky and Alekhine from 1938. It is black to play, and I mean, I said that in this setup here, where was it? This was the Taras Chigorin match. A2, we keep the black rook active. It works against this pawn configuration. It doesn't work against this one. So in this game, where we've already got this rook sort of actively defending the pawn from the side. I mean, all right, the white h-pawn's got to get forward. That's not going to take long for white to engineer. But we haven't got the sort of the favourable pawn configuration for the defending side. So if we go for a similar sort of thing, just bring the king over to e6 and go for a just click through the actual move we want to try and play in a minute. Go for like a passive approach, king e6. White just sorts out their h-pawn, king g3, king f6, h3. I mean, what does black do here? If they do nothing, king's coming into h4. There's no checks anymore, like there was last time round. Rook behind the h-pawn, sure, check. King to e5, king to g5. And we'll swap the h-pawn for the b-pawn, but you can see we're going to get some sort of vertical cutoff or horizontal cutoff there. If rook back to h8, we can check and make our way into f6. That's a vertical cutoff. I know Grigoriev's combined method doesn't work with a knight's pawn, but we've already got too far up the board with our king. So I mean, if rook g8, we would just move the pawn, and if the king gets checked, then we can play king to g7. I mean, I'm sure there's some lateral defending of the pawn that could also be done to get you like one crucial tempo as well. So that was if black does nothing. If they try and, well, this is also a bit doing nothing, king g6, the white king still comes into h4. Rook h2, check, king g7, push the g-pawn, king h7, king to g4, and we're going to be doing this, and you can see that's gone. So in the original position, because the pawns are sort of this configuration rather than what we saw in the other game, it's not going to work for black to just sort of stick their king over in this area of the board and try and employ the same defensive ideas with the active rook, because the rook, I guess, is just not as active. It doesn't deliver checks from the side because the white king's hiding behind the g-pawn. So we need a different plan, and I've already given away what that different plan is, so you could pause the video if you wanted to and see if you can remember the move I accidentally clicked, which was king c6. The plan is we are going to be very active with the king, and we're going to attack the white rook and come down and defend the a-pawn. That's the drawing plan this time. Now that inevitably is going to lead to the white rook getting sacked for the a-pawn, and then we've got rook versus two pawns, two connected pawns. So we're into then, can black hold that? And so good knowledge of the tail hook, for example, would be good. And we'll see some positions in a sec where that's exactly what happens. We just get rook versus two pawns, and the black king gets back just in time so that the king and the rook can hold up those two pawns. But there's also something else that black has that white needs to be careful of. I don't know if white needs to be careful not to lose the position, but it comes back to interference again. So king g3, white just gets on with, like, you're right, you're coming to attack my rook, I'm going to get on with pushing my two connected passed pawns down the board. What are you going to do about it? Well, I'm going to attack your rook, all right, rook a8, and then I'm coming down the board. h3, king b4, king f4. If white plays king h4, this is it gives you an example, just an example variation of the sorts of things that are going on. It's just too hard to analyse every single possible variation here, but just as an example of the race that's going on, if king to h4. By the way, that's why h3 was played, to give that king a place to go and hide on h4. So king h4, king b3, we've made contact with the a-pawn, the g-pawn gets pushed, rook b1, king up, queen, and this is the race we were talking about a second ago. g6, king desperately tries to get back, rook g1, king h6, king d5, king h7, king e6. We're threatening king e7, so that has to be played straight away. Draw. Just. That was like 10 moves worth. Okay, so I mean, a lot of it was just counting, but 10 moves later, if white plays king h4, we get that draw. Okay, so what about king f4? Well, I mean, the same sorts of ideas do work for black, but black has another idea here that white needs to be very careful of. Yeah, so white's top two moves here are just draws. Everything after that, and we're starting to look at an advantage for black. So, for example, I haven't prepped it, but g5. So, seems like a perfectly reasonable move. And what we're going to do here is check on c4, and I don't care which way your king goes, whether it's that way or that way. I'm going to check and interfere. And you're going to be doing two pawns versus queen. That's actually lost. Black's won that. So white does have to be careful of that. So we might see instead rook b8 check, king c3, rook back to a8, king goes back to b4, and we see a draw like that. Okay, because that's quite a clever move by black. By white, sorry, rook b8 check, force the black king. So there's no interference going to be going on now. And I guess white's desperately trying to say, go on, commit to this. I'm gonna take on your rook with my two pawns. Black doesn't have to do that. Black can just play king b4. But it's also, if you had the energy to count it out, a draw. And white needs to be careful. White has only one drawing move here. You can pause the video and try and find it if you wanted to. So forget about the tail hook and the 2 pawns. You've got to make this basically rook and 1 pawn versus king now. Although you're going to be using the h pawn. It's not just quite that actually, because you've got your h pawn as shelter from a check that would win it for black. But king g6 is the only drawing move. And it is a draw. You can see that that's going to be a draw with the same sort of thing as before. But, you know, for example, h5 would chuck away the draw. Check. King h6. King to f6. Your g-pawn's gone. There's no stalemate ideas. So that's a defensive try as well. We had an active rook. Sure, if we go passive king, we lose to this pawn configuration, or even if the pawn was on h3. It would be okay against this one, as we saw in the Tarrasch, or the Tarrasch-Chigorin game variation. So you have to try something different, which is come and attack the white rook. Bring your king down to the a pawn and just go active king. Passive king doesn't do it, even though you've got an active rook. I'm trying to work out whether I'm going to spend time memorizing all of this stuff. I just think it's too much to memorize. Like, oh yeah, if white's got this pawn configuration, we need to do this. And if they've got this pawn configuration, we need to... It's just too much. We're getting back to sort of trying to systematize and catalog sort of too many different permutations of rook and 2 versus rook and 1. So I think it's going to have to be an ideas thing, and we saw interference ideas there. Yeah. It wasn't that position we saw the what was the position we saw the stalemating of the... Let's see if I can find it now. I can't remember where it was. Maybe it was this position. Yeah, I can't find it, I don't think. Is it there? It's somewhere around here, isn't it? Where if you put your king on h... It was when the rook was on a1. It was this. Let's find it. Yeah. Sorry, it took me a while to do that. h5. Don't play king h6. Okay, that's just another little tactical thing to think about. Because you get your king stalemate and you lose your a pawn. Sorry, that wasn't relevant, was it? When the rook's on this rank defending, because we'd have rook moves to stay in contact with the a pawn. Right, next. This is a game from 1986, and it is black to move. Now we know that passive rooks are bad, so white has a passive rook here, and we saw in that Smyslov study 3 pawns versus 1. The passive rook was effectively worth 2 pawns because those extra 2 pawns didn't win the game for white. And here it's 2 versus 1. We have a passive rook, but you know, the king is actually in a good place. Remember, the king should go towards its passed pawns and leave the rook to defend against the opponent's passed pawn. That's the rule. So yeah, white's got an active king and a passive rook. But at the moment, this passive rook is not actually that badly placed. That's a pretty good rank for it to be on, because the white king, you know, wants to cross that rank. So if black just plays king d5, white can play a5, and this king's going to be getting in quite happily, whilst the white rook prevents the black king from coming down the board. So king d5 would be a losing move. In fact, black only has one drawing move in this position, and it's counterintuitive because you kind of want to get your king towards the blocking of these pawns. As in, if the attacking side has got a passive rook, it's just enough to stick your king behind the pawns. But not here, because this rook is just not quite passive enough. So what you need to do is hit the rook, make it even more passive, push the g-pawn, white king comes into c4, and now you've done your job. Okay, so this is actually what happened in this 1986 game. And having done those quite clever moves, although possibly not that clever, maybe the side with the black pieces didn't realise why it was so important to do that, because they're getting this rook to be just that little bit more passive, and now they can bring their king back. Okay, they've done their job. If the white king tries to do some shouldering, we'd see check, and then we can go back and defend the. I mean, if the king b5, we can just keep checking. There, check, king d4. In fact, we can even play rook b8 in this position. The engine's saying, but I was thinking you just come back to g8 and just say to white, you've made no progress. So that was king e6. That was the king c5 variation, wasn't it? If white plays rook g3, you might wonder why they didn't play that earlier, but never mind. Rook g3, then the black king's over. b5, king c7, a5, king b7. And you can see that this passive rook is just not good enough. We've got enough space for our rook to come and attack these pawns, and would quite happily swap the g pawn for the b pawn there. So yeah, as a reminder, don't play king d5 because the white rook's not passive enough yet. Hit the rook, make it more passive. g4, good move. King c4, and then in the game, black now messed it up with g3. That's it. That's thrown away the draw. You've done the job of making the rook more passive, and all white needs to do now is support these two pawns with their king. This rook's obviously going to get lost for this pawn, but white doesn't care because these two pawns supported by their king are going to be enough to win the game. King d5, rook d8 check, king c6, rook c8 check, king b7, rook back to g8. I might come back and investigate what happens after rook c4 there. I guess we just push the b pawn, don't we? We're going to head towards the Lucena position quite quickly. Is that the only winning move before I click it? What do you reckon? Rook c4, is b5 the only winning move? I think it might be. Although then there might be some engine stuff messing around with rook b1 or something, actually. Or possibly even pushing the a pawn, I don't know. Oh no, I'm right, b5, only winning move. Woohoo! I finally got some chess right. Good news, rook takes g3, and yeah, we're going to see a vertical cut off. Well, we're going to get Lucena, aren't we, very, very quickly there. Anyway, so not rook c4, rook back to g8, a5, rook g7 check. I mean, is there much more to show? This is how the game actually went, and black resigned there. That was a game from 1986. So the moral of the story is, if you are defending 2 versus 1 and the side that's attacking has a passive rook against your 1, great, but it really does need to be passive. Okay. g4 is not passive enough, whereas that was passive. I've just realised a minute ago I said, oh, why didn't they play rook g3 straight away? I wonder if you play rook f4. Probably would. What do you reckon? Would you play g4 or rook f4? Both are fine. King f4 I meant, sorry. King f4 or g4, both are fine. Right, next. How are we doing for time? Oof, 48 minutes. This is going to be a long one. Still got 3 positions to go. This is a game from 1975. There's not much to discuss in these positions, though, so hopefully it'll be done by the hour. 1975 game, white to play. White's just winning this really, really easily. And I really just cannot for the life of me think why white played their next move. It's not even like they played a principled move that just happened to be not the right move for this position. They just played a move that went against the principles of chess, a move that makes no sense at all. What a strange move. Why? Why have they done that? King g2. We'll get back to it in a sec. f3 is a very easy win. Black pushes the b pawn. Your king's in. Okay. This black rook hasn't got enough space to attack, to check that white king. Okay. There's no need for a bridge because I guess the metaphor would be the road or the river to cross isn't big enough for the need of a bridge. So I'm getting a bit mixed up on my chess metaphors there. yeah, you can see the checks are about to run out, basically. So king f6, f4, rook c4 check, king e3. Again, the checks are about to run out, which is, I think, what we see, actually. Rook c3, king d4. It's like, what are you doing about your g-pawn? It's like, well, I'm checking you and then pushing it. And I've got the f5 square for my king. You can see that's gone. So a relatively simple win, just to block the f-pawn, and your king, which is supporting your passed pawns, which is the rule, remember. You want your king to be with your passed pawns whilst your rook deals with your opponent's passed pawn. It's a perfect setup for white. But inexplicably, white shoved their king back. Black plays b3. And just to show how won it is for white, they've still got time to play f3, which is basically the same position we just had a move down, because black's got nothing. I suppose they could get their pawn to the second rank, but it's still just completely gone. You can actually push the white king back, the black king back straight away, because that would run into checkmate, wouldn't it? And you can see that we're making progress there. No problem at all. There's no way for black to push that pawn. I mean, if the rook was on b1, it might be more difficult for white. We've covered similar positions to that already, haven't we? That's probably the one that's drawn still, because this pawn's still on the third rank, just, or something. Anyway, so yeah, king g2 was played, b3, and this next move is just crackers. White says, right, my king's had enough of this game. I'm just going to park it here on g2, and I'm now going to win this game with just my rook and my pawns. And black's like, well, okay, I'm going to play with my rook, king, and pawn. So thanks for that. King f6, check, king f7. I guess maybe white just thought that there was nothing black could do about these pawns. The point is that the white king is now too far away, because now black can come and attack. And at least one of those white pawns is falling. Check, king back to g8. We've always got this going back and forth, haven't we? Check, king back to g7. I don't even think we need to be careful about the checks there, do we? No, king f7 and king g7 and king h7. So black's well, there's a legal move. I was about to say black's 3 legal moves with the king are drawn. They are. Check. Nestles on g6. Check. King back to f7. Check. All right, you've got your rook in a place where it's defending the g-pawn, but your king is still just too far away, and we can easily just hit the threaten b1 equals queen. Or if we see g6 check, we'd have to chuck this check in first. The king's actually now got to go to the h file to stop the f-pawn falling straight away. And I presume there you can just play b2 or rook f6. You can't play rook f6. Why can't you play rook f6? Are we going to set up a checkmate? Oh, because you... So I thought, right, well, surely rook f6 is fine as a drawing move. And I looked at the engine's list of moves, and rook f6 isn't there. I was like, oh my god, why doesn't that draw? It's like, because that's not rook f6. So lesson for me to not produce videos that go on for the best part of an hour. I start to get a bit tired. So yeah, rook f5 or b2 are drawn. Even rook g1 is a draw. But back about here, was it? I can't remember where it was. Somewhere around here, they agreed to draw. Right, 2 more to go. These are both exercises in the Dvoretsky book, so they're sort of testing your knowledge, I guess, of the things we've covered so far. This is a study from 1957. It is black to play. There's only one drawing move. What is it? And in fact, it's not a million miles away from the thing I was just talking about. I sort of went off on a ramble on something very similar to this, actually. This f-pawn hasn't left the third rank. So if you think back to, I guess it was this important position where this g-pawn hadn't left the third rank. So white plays a2 straight away. It was the only drawing move. it's a similar thing. Okay, rook a1. It's like, you haven't got your pawn to a2 yet, but yeah, but the white rook hasn't got behind it yet. King f4, a2, rook a4, and then we can just do nothing. Because the point is that, well, when I say do nothing, actually, we had to stop the white king coming to... No, we didn't have to. Sorry, we didn't even have to stop the white king coming to g5. We just do nothing, because there's no way for the white king to make progress. And I've has to kind of come out into the open, which would be a disaster. That would probably be a losing move for white, because we're going to see check and a queen. In fact, I'm almost certain that's a losing move for white. I've has to come out in the open and invite a check. Or in a minute after, presumably the next move is rook a6 check. Yeah, like something like king f5 here. Black can just play rook f1. g5. We just do nothing. The white king just can't get anywhere unless it gives up defense of f3. Check. King g8. Takes. King g6. Knight's pawn. Draw. Back rank defense works with a knight's pawn, remember. And he could. It was the only drawing move, was to play rook a1 and a2. If you contrast that with rook b2, white comes behind the pawn, and we defend the pawn laterally, a bit like in that Shigorin Tarash Shigorin, whichever way around it was, game. But now we haven't got the favourable pawn configuration to fire in checks from the side. The white rook cuts off the black king, and the white king's just going to be fine to sort of manoeuvre in here and hide from some checks. You know, the black king can't, the black rook, sorry, can't keep checking, because every time it's done a series of checks, it has to come back to b2 to defend the pawn. It's just hopeless, absolutely hopeless for black in that position. So yeah, you've got to, before this pawn gets off the third rank, you've got to play rook a1 and a2. And then just do nothing. You're just waiting for white to give up defense of that f-pawn. Just there it is. Go. Rook f1. Draw. Last. Am I going to get this done inside the hour? Oh, 2 minutes, 20 seconds. You already know the answer to that, don't you? If you're watching this YouTube video, because you can see the total length of the video. And if it's gone just over the hour, you're thinking, I bet you would have done it if you hadn't done this little monologue. This is a game from 1929. It is white to play. Pause the video and decide. Well, there's lots of winning moves for white, but I'll give you a choice between a winning move and a non-winning move. Are you going to play h6 or are you going to play g6? Which one of those moves wins the game? Pause the video and decide. Yeah, so this last one is super hard, and you could absolutely be forgiven for thinking, well, you don't want to push your h-pawn, do you, because of all that Klingenholwitz defensive stuff we've seen earlier on, where the black king sort of nestles itself in on g6. But actually, that is exactly what you want to do here. So h6 is your winning move, and g6 would lead to a draw. But the subtleties that surround it all are very deep. And probably the last thing you want to hear at the end of a 1 hour video is you need to go and watch the video on the Kasparian position, which I've just checked is a 45-minute video as well, to stand any chance of fully understanding everything that's going on here. So we've already seen in this pawn configuration in this video some examples of the black king nestling nicely on g6. Go and look at that video on the Kasparian position, which does cover the Klingenholwitz defensive technique as well. But it also covers, incredibly, because it's called the Kasparian position, which features here. So if white blunders away the win with g6, how does that blunder away the win? Well, black plays a2, okay, and now white's got to be careful because of the we're threatening rook g1 check and a1 equals queen. They've also got to be careful of skewers, and we know about king f2 and rook h1 from not the Vancouver defense video. So yeah, white has to play king g2, But now black plays rook b1, takes, rook back, hits the h pawn, rook a8 check, king g7, rook a7 check, king g8. The only way for white to defend their h pawn, because obviously rook g5 is going to come with check if they play h6, is rook h7. But now this is the Kasparian position, and the only way that white can eventually win this is they've got to somehow eventually release their rook from defending the h-pawn from here and bring it round to defending the h-pawn from the 5th rank. At the moment, black's got to do something with their rook because the white king is just going to come up the board and help, and that will release the white rook very happily, because once the white king's hit, like h4 for example, the rook can just go that way, and any checks we're just going to hide on h6. Okay, so if black does nothing, white's going to quite happily march their king up to support, and that's going to release the rook. In the game, black played rook g5 check and lost. This was a game from 1929. Right at the start, white blunders with right at the start, white blundered with g6, and now it went down this route, and then black blundered back there with rook g5 check. But if they understood the Kasparian position, they should play rook b3. And there's just no way that white can release their rook from... all they can do really is move their king back and forth over here. They can't release their rook, because as soon as they do, the black rook will come and attack the h-pawn, and the h-pawn can't be pushed because of check, or if the king's on h2, check and picking up the h-pawn. Anyway, watch the Kasparian position video. It's super complicated, but this would be a draw if black had played rook b3 in this position, and all of that means that you can't play g6 in the first place, because you're going to let black get the Kasparian position, where white basically can't release their rook from defending this pawn from up here. They can't get their rook down to the 5th rank where they'd want it. Excuse me. So instead of all of that, white should instead play h6. Black's like, alright, a2. And you have to follow h6 up now with the only winning move. There's only one winning move here. And again, a little bit of knowledge of the Kasparian position would have helped you find it, although it's hard to find. I mean, obviously we've got to stop rook g1 check. We've got to bring our king back to the 2nd rank. King f2 is obviously ridiculous. That would probably lose the game to rook h1, so it's got to be g2 or h2. g2 seems the most natural, but it throws away the win, and it throws away the win because you needed the g2 square for your rook. Oh. So again, that isn't precisely the Kasparian position, but it is a bit, in that you know if you knew the Kasparian position inside out, you know that the main reason you can't get your rook out from h7 is that black can come and attack your g-pawn laterally, and it's going to fall to a check on the next go. So instead, in this position, you have to, as white, play king h2, so that when black tries this, you can defend the pawn from behind with your rook. And now you can just march your king up to defend the g-pawn, blocking checks of the rook if necessary. It's not over though. King h7, and again, white has only one winning move. There's quite a few only winning moves there, weren't there? In this, well, it's actually a position from a game, so it's incredible it was that rich. But if you play king h3, you've just messed it up. I think that one was easier to see. That's now the Klingon-Horwitz defensive setup. So you can see that black was threatening that with king h7. So you have to push the g-pawn. King g8, rook to g3, and what you're doing with that rook g3 is you're ready to block checks. Okay, you're not really threatening anything at the moment. So I mean, if black starts chucking in checks, you'll see what white could now do in a minute. But for now, why doesn't black just say, well, you're not threatening anything, so I'll just do nothing, rook a5, and white's like, right, okay, deal with that. Now I'm threatening something. It's checkmate, and rook a8 is going to be way too passive. So what if black chucks in this check, rook h5 check, block? Rook G5, H7 check. Uh-oh, got to play King H8. By the way, instead of H7 check, G7 also wins in this position. You can see King H7, Rook G3. It's going to be very similar, to be honest. But H7 check. Uh-oh, King H8, Rook to G3. This is very bad news. That G pawn's coming through. Rook H5 check. King G2, King to G7, Rook back to H3. This is probably a bit more messing around than the G7 check line, actually, thinking about it. Rook G5 check, King F3. I mean, black's got to do something about that pawn that's about to queen. Rook F5 check, King G4, Rook F8, and now the king's just made contact with the G pawn. If instead of Rook F5 check in this position, black played King H8, then you can just play Rook H6, I think. Oh no, not Rook H6. What's wrong with Rook H6 is a draw. I've just messed it up. There you go, all those winning moves and I just messed it up. Rook H6, you've messed up the wing because of Rook G1. So you have to play Rook back to G3. I guess we're going to see a similar position anyway, aren't we? Great. Hasn't black got stalemate tricks there? Oh, we're going to sack the H-pawn, of course, at some point. We're going to have to sack the H-pawn and play King H6, aren't we? Yeah, just bring our king to G5. We can do some triangulation to sack the H-pawn and then play King H6. I was thinking, hang on a minute, hasn't black got some stalemate tricks there? I need to go and study my king and pawn endgames. Right, that was 1 hour, coming up to 1 hour 7 minutes. I think I stood no chance of getting that inside the hour, even with that monologue at 58 minutes that might have ruined it anyway. Really, really complicated final position, that one. And yeah, the good news is at the end of that 1 hour 7 minute video, I'm recommending you go and watch the 45-minute video on the Kasparian position. Right, that's definitely enough.